Welcome to this final lecture, in which I'll be discussing the role of the US Supreme Court as a political institution. It may seem surprising that a court of justice could be a political institution, yet this is a tweet from 2016. Today, Article 1 of the Constitution was vindicated. The Supreme Court's ruling makes the President's executive action on immigration null and void. The Constitution is clear. The President is not permitted to write laws, only Congresses. This is another major victory in our fight to restore the separation of powers. And this was tweeted by Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House of Representatives. As you can see, one decision by the US Supreme Court is hailed as a political triumph. And this is not a coincidence. But this is not covered by what we have seen so far. If the US Supreme Court is just a court of appeal, how can it intervene in the President's decisions? Well, the answer is called judicial review. And it has a history. It's not in the Constitution itself, but it is the most important power of the US Supreme Court. So let's go back to the early 19th century and a historical case called Marbury v. Madison. It's a tiny bit of history, but it's worth telling. So what happened in Marbury v. Madison? This is immediately after the 1800 election, in which Thomas Jefferson beat John Adams. And before leaving, Adams designated judges for federal courts, his friends, basically. This was called the spoils system. You have friends, you are in politics, you reward these friends with official positions. But as you can imagine, Jefferson and James Madison, his district attorney, his DA, were not exactly happy with having their enemies in power in the judiciary system. So they decided that they were not going to uphold these nominations, that they were going to ignore them. And one of the judges, named James Marbury, was unhappy with the decision. He had expected to be a judge. So he went to the Supreme Court and he argued that the Supreme Court should confirm his nomination. Why the Supreme Court? The US Senate is in charge of confirming nominations. Well, yes, but in 1789, Congress had passed a law which said that the President of the US Supreme Court could validate a judge's nomination. Now, the Supreme Court had a problem. There were two camps, and it could give victory to one camp or the other. And John Marshall was unwilling to appear to favor one camp or the other. So he came up with a solution. And that solution was to say, that law in 1789, which gives me the responsibility of confirming a judge, no, it's unconstitutional and I do not have to apply it. Why is it unconstitutional? Because this is a power which is attributed to Congress, and you cannot simply attribute it to the US Supreme Court with a law. If you want to change the Constitution, you have to use an amendment. Therefore, the law is unconstitutional, it does not apply, and I do not have to confirm James Marbury's nomination. In a word, the Supreme Court renounced a small power confirming judges' nomination, but it gained a major power, the ability to say whether something is constitutional or not, and this is called judicial review. The principle of judicial review is simple. If a law contradicts the Constitution, it is not a law by definition. And it is the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. In other words, if a law contradicts the Constitution, it does not apply. And the US Supreme Court is the body in charge of saying whether a law is constitutional or not. And you can come back to Paul Ryan's tweet, and this is what it's about. The Supreme Court declared that one action by the president is unconstitutional. So, of course, this makes the Supreme Court very important in the political system. And it makes choosing the members a crucial political choice. And this is a cartoon about a possible Obama nominee. Keep blah 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 of the Supreme Court. All I need to know about the nominee is how to spell her name. So whoever the nominee, Obama's nominee, was going to be, this man with an elephant on his cover overall, so a Republican, was going to oppose it, because that's what you do. So how do you name justices? They are named, chosen by the president, and then their nomination is confirmed by the US Senate. So you can see the executive branch and the legislative branch having to work together to confirm judges. Reagan named 4 judges, Clinton 2, Obama 2, and Trump so far 2. Which means that the most recent Democratic president named 4 judges, while Reagan and Trump together named 6. So the fact that judges are named for life means that presidents do not get the same options. And as a result, today's court is very conservative. It is headed by John Roberts, which was picked by George W. Bush in 2005. Someone who is very conservative but still attached to the Constitution. In the past, there was a sort of consensus about Supreme Court judges. So let's take Sonia Sotomayor. Chosen in 2009 by Barack Obama. She had been a judge on the US Court of Appeal, and she replaced another liberal judge. During her confirmation hearings, so she testified in front of the Senate, she was criticized, described as a liberal activist. She was asked questions about abortion and gun control. Yet eventually, the vote went 68 to 31 in her favor. So Republicans voted for her. Now, flash forward. In 2016, Antonin Scalia, a very conservative judge, died. And Barack Obama, who was still president, tried to nominate a new judge, Merrick Garland. The US Senate, which was controlled by Republicans, refused to hear Merrick Garland, who was never given an audition and who was never confirmed. So the position on the Supreme Court was held vacant until President Trump was elected, and he quickly chose Neil Gorsuch, a very conservative judge, who was nevertheless confirmed 55 to 45. So a conservative judge was replaced by another conservative judge, even though he should have been replaced by a liberal judge named by Barack Obama. So you can imagine that the tension, there was a lot of tension around this issue during the 2016 presidential election. But we come now to the most recent example, and the reason why I'm taping this video again, Brett Kavanaugh, 2018, in the fall of 2018. So Anthony Kennedy retired in the summer, and Anthony Kennedy was a swing vote. Is in purple in the graph on the right side of the slide. The swing vote, meaning that he would sometimes vote with the liberals. He would sometimes take decisions such as on gay marriage, for instance. He voted with the liberal bloc, which means that in some cases the liberals could still win with Anthony Kennedy's support. And Brett Kavanaugh is a very conservative judge nominated by President Trump, who was going to consolidate the conservative majority in the US Supreme Court in any case. But beyond that, he was credibly accused of sexual assault by multiple women. And nevertheless, he was confirmed 50 to 48. And if you remember, Kagan was confirmed 61 to 38. Now Gorsuch 55. Kavanaugh 50 to 48. So you can see the increasing political division around the US Supreme Court. And it matters a lot because, again, these people are going to be here for a long time, and it means that the US Supreme Court is now, and for the foreseeable future, a very conservative institution, which means that, for instance, the right to abortion is widely considered to be under threat because it rests on a Supreme Court decision. Still, how does the Supreme Court choose its cases? Well, it chooses to hear a case or not. Basically, it receives written requests, and then if the court decides to hear a case, it will listen to oral arguments by each party with questions and discussions, and these are lively discussions. Then after the auditions, there's a period during which the court thinks, deliberates in secret, and then writes the results. So you get a majority opinion, the opinion of the majority, and sometimes a minority opinion. And what's important is that in all these cases, you have explanations. You can know how the Supreme Court thinks about these matters. What happens with judicial review? Well, judicial review means that the Supreme Court will examine the constitutionality of an act or a law or a decision by the executive. But the Supreme Court cannot do it on its own. It has to wait for someone to complain, which means that the opponents of a law have to prove first that the law harms them, that the law has had an effect before they can go to the US Supreme Court. So it still functions like a court of justice. Someone has to have something to complain about. But after that, it goes into judicial review and the US Supreme Court can review the law. I'm just going to mention briefly this case, just to give you an example of how it goes. So this is a very famous 1989 case in which Gregory Lee Johnson burned a flag during a demonstration in Texas. And there was a law in Texas which said that if you burn a flag, you have to go to prison for a year. But Johnson argued that he was protected by the First Amendment. First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Is burning a flag part of the freedom of speech? And the argument is truly about the Constitution. I think it's the most important case. I said that it goes to the heart of the First Amendment. To hear things or to see things that we hate test the First Amendment more than seeing or hearing things that we like. It wasn't designed for things we like. They never needed the First Amendment. What you see here in this argument, defending Johnson, is the idea that all the cases which go to the US Supreme Court are very much about the Constitution and what it means. Should we interpret or should we just read the words? And this is a question which has been key to the functioning of the US Supreme Court, in particular since the 1960s. So I'm going to skip that and mention briefly that this is a system of checks and balances that we've seen so far, and we can now add two things. We can now add judicial review from the judicial branch towards the executive branch and towards the legislative branch. So now we have a complete system of checks and balances, and you can see the arrows. Each branch can check and balance the powers of the others. I'm going to conclude this section with a few words about the role which the US Supreme Court has had in the political history of the United States. First, to mention that in the 19th century and up to the mid-20th century, it was a very conservative institution. In particular, in 1896, in the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case, it affirmed the separate but equal doctrine, which means that it was perfectly okay to segregate black people in the United States. It was a very restrictive interpretation of the 14th and 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, which said that, well, separate but equal was acceptable under the Constitution. Later in the 20th century, the US Supreme Court invalidated many decisions taken by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration during the New Deal. But then things changed after the Second World War. And after the Second World War, the US Supreme Court was widely perceived to be liberal, that is, in favor of reform, as opposed to conservative. And it played a crucial role during the Civil Rights Movement. In particular, the Brown v. Board of Education of 1954 was a reversal of Plessy v. Ferguson, in that it suggested that segregated schools were unconstitutional. And it was a unanimous decision. And this is probably the most significant decision by the US Supreme Court in the 20th century, reversing segregation. So you should know that name, Brown v. Board of Education, and you should also know Plessy v. Ferguson from the previous slide. Another key decision would be Roe v. Wade, which I mentioned briefly before, which guarantees the right to abortion in the United States. Well, it doesn't guarantee the right to abortion. It declares that based on the 14th Amendment and the right to privacy, it is unconstitutional for states to ban abortion during the first 3 months. As you can imagine, it was a controversial decision, and it is still a rallying cry. And there is ground to think that Donald Trump was elected because he promised to nominate judges on the Supreme Court who would reverse Roe v. Wade. And now that we are in this situation with a strong 5-4 conservative majority, there is concern that Roe v. Wade is in fact going to be overturned, going to be changed. But it's too early to be certain about that. So, I'd like to conclude very briefly on the US political institution to remind you that the Constitution is a constant reference. We've seen it everywhere as a symbol, as a form of government, as a historical document. It is mentioned by everyone all the time. You should be familiar with that document. That whenever questions arise about the Constitution, the US Supreme Court is the one in charge of deciding whether something is constitutional or not. I've also emphasized the role of symbols. We have a system of government, but a system of government, it relies on symbols. And in particular, the president as an authority, a very important authority, but that authority is predicated on the use of symbols, on the fact that the president has a symbolic function, as the only person elected by the entire nation. I've also emphasized the system of checks and balances, which is meant to generate compromise by dividing power inside the federal government, but also dividing power between the federal government and the states, which is called federalism. And to conclude, but of course this can evolve, the current situation suggests that this system of checks and balances has reached its limits because none of the two parties is willing to compromise. And this divisions between the branches, this partisanship, that is the fact that people now think they have to vote with their party every time, is leading increasingly to a paralysis, and in particular to a much weakened legislative branch. Congress is widely seen as being ineffective, and this is a serious problem for democratic life in the United States. Well, that concludes my series of lectures. Thank you very much.